כעת נצפה בהרצאה קצרה של אנדריאס שלייכר. אנדריאס שלייכר הוא מנהל תחום חינוך ומיומנויות בארגון ה-OECD, הארגון לשיתוף פעולה ולפיתוח כלכלי, ויועץ לראשי הארגון בענייני חינוך. שלייכר יזם את מבחני הערכה הבינלאומיים, ביניהם מבחני פיזה, המבחנים הבינלאומיים באוריינות קריאה, מתמטיקה ומדעים. הוא מפקח על ביצועם. שלייכר עבד למעלה מ-20 שנה עם שרים ומנהיגי חינוך ברחבי העולם לשיפור האיכות והשוויון בחינוך. רבים חושבים שהוא האיש החשוב ביותר בתחום החינוך. הרצאתו עוסקת ביצירתיות ומטה-קוגניציה.
Hello and my congratulations to Semira Meravec for being awarded the Israel Prize for Education. I've known Semira for so many years and in so many functions, as a researcher, as an educator, as a representative in OECD bodies. But one thing that has always struck me is her capacity to think ahead of our times. To devote attention to the kind of research questions, policy issues, the frame of future. And her work on creativity and metacognition are just the perfect examples of this. Who of us would have devoted the level of attention to those issues before the advent of artificial intelligence? ChatGPT pushed us to think us so much harder. What makes us human? Education has created an amazing world around us. Think of our culture, our language, our technology, our ways of living. But it's also left us with some fundamental disconnect. Now, the disconnect between that infinite growth imperative and the very finite resources of our planet, between the financial economy and the real economy, between the wealthy and the poor, between what we call our gross domestic product and the well-being of people, between what is technologically possible and the social needs of people, between the way we govern ourselves and the voicelessness of many. And in the middle of all of that, we get struck by a pandemic that disrupted our lives, but also our thinking about education. And the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic. And artificial intelligence, puts into question so many things we took for granted in education. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we told them. But what is going to make us human in this world of artificial intelligence, where the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate? And that's not the end of the story. There's so many other forces that force us to think more creatively about the future. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We can't predict the future. But we need to become better to think in terms of alternative versions of that future. Not to think about the future we think is most likely or the future we like, but to think about alternatives. And if we are becoming better at that, we will be better prepared for the future that eventually arrives. At the OECD, we've been devoting quite a level of attention to how artificial intelligence compares with humans. And, one way of doing this is ask, ChatGPT how well it does on some PISA tasks. And we found, for example, that, in 22, technology could get about 28% of the PISA mathematics tasks right now. That's not as good as 15-year-old humans now. But when we repeated that exercise with GPT-4 in March this year, we could see that share had risen to 46%. So basically, technology is advancing at a breathtaking speed, whereas it's really hard to improve human performance. And the drivers are not so difficult to understand, and the consequences, routine tasks are disappearing from our lives, our work, technology-intensive tasks are on the rise. You put the two things together, that's the future of work. Nobody knows whether technology is going to destroy more jobs than it creates or create more jobs than it destroys, but the direction of travel is very clear now. The increased value that is being placed on qualities that make us human, including creativity. But when we ask, 15-year-olds, what do you want to do in your life? What kind of job would you aspire to when you are 30? We could see actually that, 30, 40, sometimes 50% of 15-year-olds aspire to the kind of jobs that are at the highest risk of automation. And that really shows that often we still educate children for our past, not for their future. And then look at this. Most recently, we asked 10 and 15-year-olds about their creative activities, their creativity. And we found that in every city for which we collected data, 15-year-olds reported lower levels of creativity than 10-year-olds. Well, if I would tell you here, your 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than your 10-year-olds, you would say, well, that's crazy, or something terribly is going wrong at schooling. But that's what we see when it comes to the creativity of 10 and 15-year-olds. Because it escapes our radar screen. It's not something that is at the core of education. We too often take creativity as a kind of byproduct of education, not at the heart of education. And that's such a shame because, children are born with an abundance of creativity. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you tell them. They're going to, experiment with anything that gets into their hands. They're always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when their context changes. But then, we put them into schools and we try to make them compatible with our ways of thinking, and we lose some of that resource, that energy of the 21st century. I'm a scientist by background, and I must say it often breaks my heart when I see how we teach science like religion. We try to, teach people some kind of scientific theorem, then we give them lots of, practices to, rehearse that, and at the end we test whether they remember the answers that we told them. There's nothing to do with science. And science has always been about inquiry, not about reproducing the wisdom of our times, but about questioning it. Can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Those are the big questions of our times. History is not about names and places, but can you think like an historian? Do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it advanced, how it developed, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes? Well, there's a lot to do in education. Some people compare that, with a race between education and technology. Before the first industrial revolution, neither education nor technology made a big difference for the vast majority of people. But then, the industrial revolution pushed technology ahead of the skills of people and created a huge amount of social pain. People were not ready for that. But then, we built schools trying to make people compatible with the industrial norms, and it worked. It created generations of prosperity. But now we see technology doing the same thing again, pushing people behind, moving technology ahead, and creating the same level of social pain. You have young people graduating from universities and having difficulties finding a good job, and at the same time employers tell you they cannot find the people with the skills they need. So how do we turn that around? And this is where creativity and metacognition are so central. We haven't, measured metacognition in PISA, but we've measured something that's related to this, and that's what we call a student's growth mindset. On the right side, you see countries where students, see the sky as the limit to their learning. They always push the boundaries, and they feel they can overcome those boundaries. On the left side, you see countries where, most students believe that intelligence is their source of success. And if you believe that, of course, why would you try to study hard? On the vertical axis, you see the academic success of students, and you see that actually the two are pretty well related. Now, if you look at a country like Estonia, doing well on growth mindset, also doing well academically. If you look at a country of Indonesia, students believing, it's all about the intelligence I was born with and not so successful academically. And Israel, too, is very much on that straight line now. And it's not just about academic success. We can see that students with a growth mindset were more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. And that brings us back right to the topic. If you want children who are creative, you have to give them space to experiment. If they experiment, they take risks. If they take risks, they make mistakes. If our education systems do not help learners to learn from and with mistakes, to be aware of their own learning strategies, maybe they're not going to become so creative. And it's not the end of the story. If you look at, the companies that are successful these days, and they're all companies of the intangibles. Now, Israel is the poster child of hosting those companies. If you look at, the traditional Fortune 500, the engines of our growth in the past, they are still, existing, but they're no longer the success story. The future is all about intangibles, and that is about knowledge and our capacity to mobilize, share, disseminate it. Innovation. You look at the number of patents, how it's rising exponentially. We are living in the time of ideas. The most successful companies these days are not created by a big industry. They are created by a big idea. They often have their products before they even get their money. And then there is this digital world that helps us to learn in new ways, but also that pushes us to think hard about the knowledge and skills that are really needed. We see that wisdom of the crowds. When I went to school, literacy was very easy. It was all about extracting, knowledge from prefabricated texts. Texts, school books that were carefully curated, authored, approved by governments. If I didn't know the answer to a question, I could look it up and I could trust the answer I find wherever it's printed to be true. Today, young people look up things on Google and they get 100,000 answers to their question. Nobody's going to tell them what's right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. And we have those multiple identities. We post whatever we like on social media. Very, very different world. But once again, are learners ready for that? And that's something we studied quite carefully in our last PISA assessment. We looked at digital navigation skills. And here you can see on the left side a few countries where you can say, well, a good majority of 15-year-olds, is able to distinguish fact from opinion, is able to triangulate different knowledge, information sources. Those kinds of skills that you need to be a digital native. But in most countries, students struggle with those kinds of tasks. They are born into the digital world, but they are not digital natives. Because, it is those creative skills, those metacognitive skills, those navigation skills that makes us digital natives. And again, we are still teaching students answers, not questions. If you think about the learners of tomorrow, they need a very, very different skill set. They need to be able to adapt to very different worlds around them. They need to learn how to have a positive impact on this world, to articulate their own experiences, to be able to listen, to be listened to overcome challenge, to grow beyond their limits, to be ready to thrive in a changing world where change is an opportunity. And of course that has implications for educators. Educators who are creative designers of innovative learning environments, who work with a high degree of professional autonomy and yet in a collaborative culture. Educational, institutional cultures that value people and processes over classrooms and devices. Staff who are good at building partnerships with other schools, with other people, with other stakeholders, with parents, with families. Who are able to lead, reach, and learning processes and innovative environments. That's the world we need to aspire to. And of course, as Semira, right away, this is always about reconciling tensions and dilemma. Now, how do we, reconcile modernizing education gradually and harnessing these disruptive forces, of a pandemic, of technology, of artificial intelligence? Now, how do we reconcile new goals with old structures? Now, how do we educate globally minded students who still remain rooted in their local cultures and traditions? Now, because, students who don't have a floor under their feet are the ones who are going to build walls around them. It's very important to build that kind of rootedness. Now, How do we leverage innovation in that very risk-averse environment, social environment of education, parents included? We as parents get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was important for us, or when they start to learn things we no longer understand. How do we reconcile the potential with the reality, the virtual world and the real world, the face-to-face world, recognizing the potential of technology, but also that learning will always be a social, a relational enterprise. And last but not least, and that brings me back to the questions of Simera, how do we reconcile learning and education? Thank you very much.